November 1983 arrived with damp streets, early dusk, and the quiet grind of routine across Western Europe. Office lights glowed over maps and calendars. Radios carried clipped headlines about inflation and summit dates. In the background, a large NATO exercise moved forward with scheduled messages and rehearsed decisions. To most people, the week felt ordinary. To a small circle of analysts, it did not. The timing, the tone, and a handful of subtle signals could be read in more than one way. The same action that looked like training from Brussels might, from Moscow, look like a curtain raised on something else. This program presents a careful reconstruction of that uneasy week. It is rooted in public history and open recollections. It includes cautious inference where records are thin and memories vary. The aim is clarity without drama and context without final judgment. Details that risk confusing the core story are avoided. Technical specifications and exact procedures are not explored. The focus stays on atmosphere, perception, and the fragile boundary between rehearsal and action. What follows is a narrative designed for thoughtful listening. Names are used sparingly. Private motives are not asserted. The story is speculative in form, but anchored in known events. It may offer one possible reading of signals that officials in 1983 weighed in real time. It does not claim to settle what any side truly intended. It invites attention to how misread signs can move great powers close to outcomes no one openly sought. Across the cities of Western Europe, the season felt familiar. Commuters moved through train halls in heavy coats, newspapers folded neatly under arms. Office clocks ticked past the hour with unremarkable patience. Yet, within alliance buildings in Brussels and other capitals, there was a subtle edge to routine. The exercise that November did not break from custom in obvious ways. It still moved through scheduled prompts and formal messages. It still followed the familiar rhythm of planning days and reporting nights. Even so, certain touches felt sharper at the margins. Observers later pointed to a tighter public posture and a guarded tone in briefings. None of it proved intent. Taken together, it colored the air. The Cold War had settled into habits that masked risk behind ordinary steps. Drills were part of that habit. Publicly, they reassured. Privately, they tested nerves. This one occurred after a year of harsh rhetoric and sobering incidents. The temper of the time made even simple moves feel louder. Key staff logged longer hours. Paper stacks rose on desks. Voice lines carried precise phrases with an almost ceremonial cadence. It would have seemed dull if not for the wider context. There had been tension over deployments and protests in city squares. There had been near misses in the skies that year. People sensed strain without naming it. The mood of late 1983 was sober and guarded. The exercise fit that mood like a key in a stiff lock. The itinerary pressed on. Participants followed checklists and signed routine forms. Some steps were visible by design. Many were ordinary. Workdays closed with fluorescent light and burnt coffee. Night watches opened with the soft clack of typewriter keys. Maps lay flat, with lines no different from last season. Yet analysts who studied patterns knew that perception did not wait for proof. A sequence of small changes could influence how a rival read intent. Two signals stood out inside that landscape. One was the unusual presence of very senior officials in certain command hubs. The other was tightened radio discipline that trimmed casual chatter and kept phrasing blunt. Neither signal alone declared anything. Together they shaped the silhouette of the week. While the public voice described a drill, the silhouette could appear dense and opaque from across the divide. That opacity mattered. The Cold War worked through glass that was never clear. Each side learned to interpret shadows as if they were features. Bureau desks became weather stations for political pressure. Rough weather could be forecast from faint data. The exercise unknowingly added to the fog. A normal movement on one map appeared as a prepared movement on another. Even the time of year felt symbolic to some minds. Late autumn suggested closing windows and hardening ground. The exercise stepped through its phases, and the atmosphere thickened in parallel. Meanwhile, daily life went on with its own strong pull. Street markets opened in the chill mornings. Families set tables under warm lamps. Stadiums filled for weekend matches. The division between open life and closed rooms felt wide and hard. Citizens slept without alarm. Inside the closed rooms, the tone became clipped and cautious. Analysts wrote notes that favored conditional verbs. Briefers repeated the word routine with steady emphasis. Routine is powerful in large systems. It can calm. It can blind. By that week, it did both. The risk did not come from a single lever or button. It came from a stack of small assumptions. A rival sees your rehearsal. The rival wonders whether it masks a countdown. You respond with a bland statement. The rival sees a bland statement as noise. Days pass on this track until someone decides that a pattern has shifted. That decision can be wrong but still decisive. The week in 1983 invited such decisions because context pressed so hard on the lens. The exercise did not intend to simulate crisis in public view. Yet crisis hovered as a possible reading of routine. People who knew the period well later said that silence was the loudest sound. Silence on certain channels. Silence around certain calendars. Silence that looks like confidence to one side. Silence that looks like cover to the other. These are not dramatic devices. They are the ordinary tools of large bureaucracies. In that sense, the story shows how calm surfaces can conceal sharp edges. This chapter stays in Western Europe, where the surface held. The next turns east, where the same surface looked different, and where the fog grew thick enough to change posture. On the far side of the line, Soviet analysts watched the same week unfold through a different lens. Their work was shaped by a long memory of invasion scares and bruised pride. It relied on fragments. Some came from open broadcasts. Some came from travelers and trade papers. Some came from listening posts that fed measured reports into secure rooms. The frame was simple. Surprise from the West could not be ruled out. Surprise could arrive under cover of a drill. That frame was not new in 1983. It was old and well-worn. What made it acute was saturation. The year had delivered words and events that primed suspicion. Against that backdrop, the November exercise landed with a thud. Staff officers in Moscow and regional centers sorted new pieces into old boxes. They asked predictable questions with fresh urgency. Does the tone of Western messaging differ from last season? Do movements near sensitive corridors match past practice? Does scheduling align with political calendars? Most answers were gray, not black or white. Gray answers invite protective action. Protective action, in turn, looks like preparation when viewed from the other side. The cycle is well known, but hard to break when stakes are grave. Reports circulated that hinted at compressed decision times in the West. Reports also claimed increased presence of senior figures near communication hubs. Such points are soft as evidence and strong as alarms. As a pair, they formed an indicator set that was hard to ignore. Senior presence implies significance. Compressed times imply urgency. Together, they suggest a window that must be watched with care. Inside the Soviet system, caution could escalate fast. Requests for updates become demands. Draft memos become directives. Layers of approval shrink. Units tighten procedures. None of this confirms a hostile plan. It builds a hedge against surprise. The hedge then thickens the fog. In 1983, the fog came not only from intelligence gaps, but also from the social climate within the apparatus. Careers depended on avoiding blame for missed threats. No one was eager to downplay a pattern that might age badly. The result was an upward drift in alarm. Messages written in the language of prudent watchfulness were read 2 floors up as warnings of imminent risk. Analysts asked for new sampling of intercepts. Supervisors asked for alternate routes to confirm those samples. A second pass often produced the same gray picture. Gray repeated enough times can look like a stain. At that stage, choice is narrow. The safest bureaucratic choice is to assume the worst while claiming only the likely. The safest political choice is to stay ready while speaking of caution. The words used in public hold calm. The posture behind the words tightens. It is a familiar dance in periods of strain. The timeline of the exercise did not slow to accommodate these anxieties. It moved step by step toward its final phase. To some in Moscow, the convergence of that phase with the broader climate felt awkward. A rally on one side can look like a march to a rival. The risk was not in any single feature of the drill. It was in the ensemble. Analysts had seen ensembles like this in case studies taught in windowless rooms. They had learned to ask which features owned the tempo and which were decoration. In November 1983, the tempo felt insistent, even when single notes were not. People involved in that reading later recalled an atmosphere of grim attention. They avoided theatrical language. They stressed prudence and duty. They tried to separate noise from signal. They could not ignore two consistent hints: senior presence near keynotes, decision cycles that felt shorter than usual. Those hints anchored their caution without requiring flamboyant claims. The public never saw these debates. Families in apartment blocks went about their routines with steady discipline. Streetcars clanged through early evenings. Storefronts darkened in the frost. Behind the common scenes, the apparatus leaned forward. This is not a claim of intent to strike. It is a description of posture formed under pressure. The distinction matters. If a rival misreads posture as intent, then normal friction can become a trigger. This chapter remains careful about labels. It holds the moment at the threshold where intelligence becomes policy. That threshold is narrow in any system built on fear of surprise. The next chapter moves into rooms where such fear meets prestige and memory, and where it becomes a problem of leadership rather than analysis. Inside the highest offices, the mood was controlled and tense. Senior figures carried the burden of history that stretched back to invasions, purges, and uneven recoveries. They also carried the daily grind of a large state with brittle nerves. The November exercise arrived as a test of judgment rather than capacity. Capability was known on both sides. The open world measured that. Intent was the true unknown. Leaders asked whether a rehearsal could hide a countdown and whether prudence required acting as if it might. The answers were shaped by personality and by institutional gravity. Some advisors urged a strict reading of precedent and urged calm. Others called for visible readiness so that no one mistook restraint for weakness. Across meetings, the same words recurred: likely, possible, unclear, proof, window, risk. Those words framed an argument that did not end with a pure decision. It evolved into a posture. That posture could be described as a guard raised high without a shouted challenge. It included specific internal steps that need not be listed here. It included public phrasing that muted emotion. The friction came from the same two indicators that troubled the analysts. Briefings mentioned ambiguous patterns that placed senior people near critical nodes. They also noted that Western decision cycles appeared compressed relative to the spring. These points did not impose a conclusion. They kept the argument alive. In the background sat the memory of past episodes where waiting had carried a political cost. Prestige mattered in rooms built on status and ceremony. So did control. No leader wished to look reactive. None wished to look reckless. The compromise was vigilance with a hard edge. That edge could be felt in the timing of calls and the choice of words in memos. It could be seen in eyes around conference tables. The mood did not favor jokes. It favored careful verbs and short sentences. The leadership did not believe every dire reading from the services. Yet, it did not dismiss them either. Each summary landed on a stack that looked heavier by the hour. Each question added weight. How much of the Western drill was scripted theater? How much could be flexible? Were public remarks crafted to soothe or to distract? If it was theater, what did the casting say about intent? If it was flexible, what did the schedule admit? These questions did not produce clean charts. They produced more questions. The final days of the exercise brought modest signs that the pace would soon ease. Some leaders took comfort in that. Others warned against relief. It was still possible, they said, that the close would mask a pivot. That view was not majority consensus. It lingered at the edge of discussion like a chill draft. No one could fully seal the window. The structure of the system also shaped choices. Information moved upward in ways that trimmed nuance. Writers of reports tried to be precise. Readers of reports heard alarm. That compression is common in large bureaucracies under stress. It grows when rival rhetoric is sharp and when the calendar feels crowded. 1983 had both. The result was a dangerous alignment. Interpretation at the top depended on filtered fragments, and filtered fragments were inclined to caution. Restraint required confidence that the filters had not hardened conclusions prematurely. Confidence was in short supply. The top level could not spend days on every thread. It concentrated on the signals that appeared most credible. Two such signals remained on the table: senior presence near keynotes in the West, decision cycles that felt tighter than spring. They were not proof. They were anchors for policy phrases like prudent vigilance Anchors weigh down ships. They also keep them from drifting. The leaders tried to do both, hold fast and avoid collision. There was no appetite for sudden grand moves. There was no appetite for soft posture. The line between the two was thin. A resolute posture could look to a rival, like a coiled spring. That is the puzzle at the heart of the story. It is also the reason these rooms felt heavy, even as streets outside stayed calm. At the close of the week, advisors crafted reflections that stressed the value of clear signaling. They did not claim to have parsed every sign correctly. They claimed to have avoided a worse outcome. Such claims are hard to test. They serve to defend choices already made. This narrative does not judge them. It holds the temperature of the room and the rhythm of the calls. It notes the eyes that stayed on clocks and the files that never left the table. It leaves the exercise nearing its last turns, with leaders wary of missteps and cautious not to show it. The next chapter moves back to the signal world, where words, silences, and patterns fought for meaning in a fog that neither side could fully lift. Across the exercise's middle days, the story settled into sound. Not the loud kind, quiet tones that mattered more because they were thin and hard to frame. Analysts in both blocks traced routine phrases that usually flowed without drama. This time the flow felt clipped. Words landed with firm edges. Confirmations arrived with fewer pleasantries. Small changes like that can be harmless in a long week. They can also hint at a tighter grip. People who measure such things watch for pivots rather than shocks. Two features stood out for them. One was stricter discipline on routine channels that usually carried light filler. The other was a series of brief pauses at hours when nothing normally paused. Neither feature proved intent. Both pressed the mind toward caution. Teams in Western rooms kept their focus on drill timelines and evaluation sheets. They understood that every exercise grows a private language as it nears the end. People shorten phrases for speed. People cut color to avoid confusion. That is ordinary. Yet the same choices can alarm watchers who lack the local context. Meanwhile, on the eastern side, reports that arrived after midnight used careful verbs. They said that Western phrasing appeared compressed. They said that the cadence of messages felt urgent. They did not claim that action was certain. They pointed to texture rather than content. Texture is hard to answer with a single proof. It lingers and breeds doubt when other facts are scarce. The ambient climate of 1983 supported that doubt. There had been a grim series of incidents that year that gnawed at trust. There had been harsh speeches that left little room for grace. Recording all that in a ledger is simple. Removing its effect on judgment is not. The exercise, therefore, moved through a field that was already charged. A shout was not required to produce alarm. A whisper could do the work. Inside Alliance facilities, briefers kept repeating the word routine. They were not performing. They were trying to prevent drift toward drama. They knew drills are meant to test systems, not resolve history. They also knew that external readers set their own terms. It was easy to imagine how a rival might look at the same hour and find a different picture. Analysts there could argue that senior figures had been seen near important desks. They could argue that message pacing felt different from spring. If both claims held even partly true, the picture changed tone. The change need not be large. It only needed to cross a personal threshold inside a chain of responsibility. Once crossed, the threshold fixes the mind. Small comforts no longer comfort. New information is fitted to an alert frame. That is not a mark of panic. It is the effect of duty under pressure. People who hold keys to big decisions choose to be wrong on the safe side. That choice often adds friction without producing crisis. It can also make a clean end harder to reach because signals lose softness. Softness matters in a long rivalry where silence often carries the message. During these days, Western participants carried on with standard evaluations. The room smelled of paper, coffee, and fatigue. The tempo rose as checklists neared completion. The atmosphere in Eastern offices rose too, for other reasons. Directives requested faster updates from observers. Analysts were told to compare current phrasing with notes from prior seasons. Pattern readers do this as a craft. They know patterns are never perfect. They know memory can be cruel. Even so, they must file judgments. The safest judgment is that risk has increased and should be watched. That line fills the file with care and places the file on top of a stack. Across the divide, a similar file is labeled with the word exaggerated. Each label is honest within its room. Neither resolves the mismatch. During one night in the late phase, the quiet pauses came again. Shorter than before, not many. Enough to feed the running debate about tempo and intention. In the morning, desk officers discussed whether those breaks were the result of fatigue, procedural steps, or something more deliberate. No one could say with confidence. Confidence is hard to build when mistrust is the climate. It is not rebuilt by a single call or line in a newspaper. It is rebuilt by long patience that 1983 did not grant. The drill kept its pace. The Eastern Watch kept its nerve. At this point, the story requires a simple statement. What sent the temperature higher were not grand maneuvers. It was the pairing of two ordinary signs that looked different in context. Stricter discipline on routine channels. Brief pauses where continuity once sat. Both have innocent explanations inside a drill. Both can look suggestive when fear is the backdrop. The double reading created a hall of mirrors. Each side saw its own restraint as calming. Each side saw the other's restraint as cover. The mirror effect thickened the fog in ways that standard briefings struggled to thin. Western analysts began to hear that the other side was leaning forward. The reports did not shout. They hinted. That was enough to make some people check their assumptions. A few phrases in internal notes took a cooler tone. Officials repeated that the schedule remained unchanged. They were right about the schedule. They could not be sure about how the schedule looked from across the line. A single wrong move in such a climate could break weeks of discipline. No one wished to supply that move. The day passed without incident, and the next one began under the same cloud of careful routine. The exercise pushed toward its closing sequence. The fog did not lift. It shifted. The chapter ends on that small shift, when both sides heard the same static and gave it different burdens. The next chapter shows what happens when the burden becomes a posture that reaches the edge of open alarm, yet remains just shy of it. By now, enough fragments had accumulated to change the temperature of the week. Within certain Western assessments, a new caution appeared. The language was muted but clear. It suggested that Eastern forces might be reading the drill as more than training. It also suggested that parts of the rival apparatus had tightened posture in ways that were not purely symbolic. The reports did not list inventories. They did not claim imminent action. They highlighted two practical hints that carry weight in any era. One was a pattern of restricted leaves for select units in the East. The other was a cluster of internal notices that appeared to shorten response times. Neither hint shocked veterans of the period. Both were taken seriously because they touch rhythm rather than hardware. Rhythm is how large systems reveal mood. If rhythms change, moods change. In offices from Brussels to other capitals, senior staff discussed how to finish the exercise without sending the wrong signal. Ending a drill is not as simple as flipping a sign from open to closed. There is a choreography that protects order. That choreography can also look staged to a rival who suspects a pivot. The aim became to reduce noise while keeping faith with schedule. A few external statements used plain language that treated the week as routine. The words were chosen to calm rather than impress. Inside rooms, the tone was more guarded. Analysts compared the rivals' recent posture to notes from the spring. Some felt the current moment was similar. Others put it half a step beyond. The difference was small on paper. It felt larger in the gut. Across the line, the Eastern apparatus had its own debate. Files suggested that Western planners were closing in on final moves. Those moves might be drama only. They might not. When the world is divided by distrust, the safest guess becomes the standard. That guess drives a series of practical measures, each modest alone. Routes are reviewed. Duty rosters adjusted. Secure lines checked for clarity. None of it proclaims a plan to strike. All of it is consistent with a system that does not want to be caught flat. The result looks like alert to the other side. Western observers saw enough of that result to raise their own guard a notch. The notch was not public. It existed in the speed of cross-checks and the brevity of internal language. Tension is not only a matter of resources, it is also a matter of sentences. Short sentences build when people prefer to reduce room for misunderstanding. Throughout these hours, the public sphere stayed calm. Markets opened. Lectures continued at universities. Trains kept time. In homes, families discussed winter plans. News pages mentioned diplomacy and budgets. Few lines hinted at strain. That is often the shape of such weeks. Calm at the surface. Edge under the paint. People inside the systems tried to protect that calm. They minimized steps that could be read as theater. They avoided words that might harden suspicions. Yet the very act of caution can look purposeful if the watcher mistrusts your reasons. This is the paradox at the heart of late 1983. It is why the phrase "world on alert" fits without exaggeration. The world did not march, it leaned. The lean was enough to frighten people who knew how close misreadings can cut. Meanwhile, the exercise entered its closing window. Checklists moved toward signatures. Plans for return to normal posture were opened. That alone held risk. A transition can resemble a feint to those who think they see design. Western officials aimed to be as transparent as the format allowed. They could not open the innards of the drill to outside eyes. They could shape the tone. The tone they chose was dry and plain. Across the line, some readers appreciated that dryness. Others found it too neat. They kept their guard high. The two indicator hints remained in their files like thumbprints. Restricted leaves for a few units. Notices that trimmed response times. These are common measures in uncertain periods. They mean less than hard orders and more than idle talk. Their presence made a clean read impossible for anyone trained to fear surprise. That training had deep roots. It reached back through decades of scars. The policy choice, therefore, stayed the same. Remain ready. Speak of caution. Watch for any change in Western cadence that might reveal a pivot. In truth, there was no pivot. There was only the end of a drill, and the hope that this end would be read as an end. That hope was reasonable and also fragile. As the last full day opened, Western assessments noted a slight easing in rival messaging. The emphasis here is on slight. A few lines that had sounded taut now sounded firm instead. Firm is better than taut. It is not calm. People inside the rooms did not relax. They were too close to the finish to assume anything. They kept their eyes on scheduled steps and avoided flourishes. Outside, the early dark of November settled over cities and fields. Streetlights came on. Cafes filled. Radios played weekend music. Few listeners knew how nervous the quiet had been. The chapter closes on that quiet. It holds the edge without breaking it. The next chapter follows the exercise into its last hours, when the line held and the danger passed not with fanfare, but with the tired relief of people who had concentrated for too long. The final phase arrived without ceremony. Timelines matured and steps unfolded in the order that planners had mapped weeks before. The difference lay not in what happened, but in how each side read the closure. Western participants executed their tasks with a mix of fatigue and discipline. They understood that the safest exit is the simplest exit. No bravado. No sudden shifts. The language used in internal notes stayed dry and guarded through the last hour. The tone mattered more than any single act. It was the last layer of signal available to outside ears. Across the line, the Eastern apparatus watched for telltale changes. It had prepared for a hard turn that might emerge under cover of routine. That turn never came. Instead, two modest signs began to collect at the edge of their dashboards. The pace of Western messaging eased toward a steadier cadence. The small pauses that had fed doubts became rarer. At the same time, hints appeared that very senior figures were less visible at certain hubs. Those hints were uncertain. They were enough to lift the shoulders of a few exhausted readers. Hints never prove a thing. They soften conclusions. Softness in conclusions is what lets posture drift back toward normal. The drift began as the clock moved past the point where a pivot would have made sense. That point is not written in any public note. Professionals on both sides can feel it. A window closes not with a click, but with a dull seal. After that seal, nerves remain tight from habit rather than necessity. The mood gradually followed the facts. In Western rooms, station chiefs and desk officers completed their final checks. They noted where phrasing had worked and where it had allowed confusion. They wrote summaries that avoided heat. The choice was deliberate. Heat in an after-action note can echo into policy and sour the next cycle. These teams preferred understatement. It matched the public line that had steadied them all week. Official statements kept the same cool register. No boasts, no sharp claims about the other side. The story would live best as a reminder rather than a lecture. Over in the east, staff collected the last reports and trimmed the alert posture in measured steps. Procedures resist rapid changes when fear has been high. People fear being the one who relaxed first. No one wanted blame if a late surprise appeared. So the easing came in stages that looked modest to outsiders and felt brave to insiders. Files were closed with care. The words likely and possible gradually returned to their older places. Senior figures took briefings that looked more like routine and less like crisis. Each day carried a little more daylight between watchfulness and alarm. The most sensitive rooms still held a guarded view. They understood that their caution had not been proven wrong by the safe end. Caution is not tested by an outcome that did not arrive. It is tested by whether the posture was proportional to the available evidence. That debate stayed quiet and unresolved. It takes courage to downgrade risk after a tense week. It takes a different kind of courage to admit that fear might have colored judgment. Systems prefer to do the first. People sometimes do the second in private. The record shows only the surface. The surface after the exercise was bland. It was meant to be. A bland surface lets a dangerous episode fade without producing public friction. Inside the systems, however, the week left marks. Training notes were updated to stress how routine signals can be misread in a charged climate. Words about tone and cadence were added to pages that once focused on structure. A few planners argued for clearer packaging of future drills. They suggested pacing that left more room for arrival to exhale. Others resisted on grounds of credibility and need. Compromise produced small changes that looked cosmetic to outsiders and important to insiders. The changes would matter most in the next season when the air felt different. For those who lived inside the 1983 week, the relief came with fatigue. People went home late and slept hard. Offices felt larger when the stacks of paper moved off the tables. There was no victory speech. There was only the familiar weight of a contest that continued without visible end. That may be the most honest detail to carry forward. The danger had been real because perception had been fragile. The safety was also real because restraint had held. Neither truth cancels the other. They live side by side in a ledger that is always open. The idea that a rehearsal could be mistaken for a countdown is not a clever twist for classroom debate. It is a recurring hazard in any long rivalry built on speed and suspicion. It demands humility from planners and patience from watchers. Both virtues are scarce in bitter years. In the closing hours, both appeared just enough. The world stepped back from a line that most citizens never saw. Streets stayed calm. Calendars turned. The echo reached only those who count echoes for a living. This chapter stands with them at that threshold. It listens for what nearly happened, and hears only the quiet sound of an argument that never moved to the next rung. The exercise ended. The risk did not vanish. It re-entered the bloodstream of a conflict that preferred habit to surprise. A habit of caution had spared everyone this time. Whether habit would be enough next time remained a question for careful minds. The file closed without a stamp of triumph. It closed because people stayed still in the right way for long enough. That is not thrill. It is craft. It is also luck. In 1983, both played a part, and the room exhaled without applause. The week faded into archived folders, but the pattern it revealed did not. A rehearsal had brushed the edge of a crisis simply by landing in a season when nerves were raw and language was tight. Public notes spoke of routine and professionalism. Private notes weighed how small signals can grow heavy inside closed rooms. The distance between those notes is where the danger lived. It is never far in a rivalry built on precaution. Two modest hints had carried more force than anyone wished. Tighter discipline on routine lines, slight shifts in who appeared where at sensitive hours. Each could be defended as ordinary. Together they formed a picture that cautious readers could not ignore. The exercise ended cleanly. The question that lingered was whether the cleanliness owed more to design, restraint, or chance. Records do not answer that cleanly. They rarely do. They keep dates and phrases and a tone that feels careful by choice. What stands out is the quiet. Quiet in streets and homes. Quiet in briefings that stayed dry when they might have grown sharp. Quiet that prevented a turn which fear could have forced. The story does not offer final judgment. It points to a narrow escape shaped by mood, memory, and human caution. Ahead lay more drills, more speeches, and more seasons where small changes might again look large. The next file would open on a desk not far from the last one. The same people, or their close peers, would decide how to show intent without inviting alarm. Whether they learned the right lesson from this week remains an open question that only the next test could address.